It's my honor to welcome you to the second day of our conference, Understanding Globalization, organized by the Center for Advanced Studies of Eurac Research here in Bolzano. So globalization is a very complex issue, and it is also related to many areas and topics, as we'll also see during this week. And one of those topics is, for example, populism. When discussing the reasons for the rise of right-wing populism or authoritarian populism, globalization often plays also a role. So therefore, in the first part of this webinar, Professor Chiara Bottici will talk about the politics of imagination, social media, and the search of authoritarian populism. But before I give you the word, I would like to shortly introduce you. So Chiara Bottici is Associate Professor in Philosophy and Co-Director of Gender Studies at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College in New York. Her research topics include modern philosophy, social and political philosophy, feminism, LGBTQI+ issues, capitalism studies, critical race theory, psychoanalysis, and aesthetics. She is very well known for her work on how images and imagination affect politics and feminist experimental writings. So she's the author of several books, including Images Beyond Imagination and the Imaginary with Columbia University Press, A Philosophy of Political Move with Cambridge University Press, and Men and States with Palgrave. So we are very happy that you're here, and finally the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be back to Italy, although virtually, and to be in conversation with all of you. We live in a stream of images. Even before COVID pandemic locked us up, the change was already quite visible. Today's politics is inseparable from the constant flux of images in front of our screens. How has this increase of images impacted our capacity to imagine? How can it be that while new technological development enable us to perceive commonalities with people living on the other side of the globe, new spectacular divisions between us and them have emerged? What is this global politics of imagination that divides us precisely at the moment in which it could bring us together? To tackle those questions, let's begin with the very term imagination. What is the imagination of which we see a peculiar politics today? On the one hand, by imagination, one can mean the faculty to portray what is not there, the unreal, as in expressions such as, "This is purely the fruit of your imagination." However, along with this usage of the term, there is another one that goes back to the ancient Greek term fantasia, the Latin term imaginatio, or the Arabic al-alma al-mital, and which is associated with the production of images in the most general sense of the term, and therefore images of both what is there and what is not there. It is the second meaning of the term imagination that interests me, because it enables us to say that without imagination, that is, without this capacity to create images, there could not be any world. Before being rational animals, humans are first and foremost imagining animals. Since the association of imagination with our reality, the first meaning of the term, is so persistent, I've elsewhere suggested a shift from the notion of imagination to the concept of imaginal, which I take from the Arabic al-alma al-mital, Soha Hardy, meaning mundus imaginalis, that is, imaginal world. Now, what is this imaginal? Whereas the concept of imagination and its associate term imaginary are usually understood in terms of in reality, the concept of imaginal simply means what is made of images and therefore does not make any ontological assumption as to the status of the image. Consequently, the imaginal is a much more open concept, one that is, in my view, very well adapted to the world of social media, in which the status of reality of the images has to be renegotiated all the time and cannot be taken for granted. Furthermore, whereas imagination tends to be conceived as an individual faculty and the social imaginary as a social context, the imaginal is simply what is made of images, and as such, it can be both the product of a single individual or, on the contrary, of a social group. Since the concept of imaginal does not make assumption to the faculty that is producing them, is, in my view, a much better tool to theorize politics in a times of widespread social media, when the line between the individual or the collective side of the process of imagining is often blurred. The politics of imagination of our time is therefore imaginal because it questions both the traditional opposition between the real and the unreal, and, as we will see, also that between the individual versus the social nature of images. But if the imaginal is simply what is made of images, should we therefore conclude that politics has always been imaginal? And if so, what has changed today? If by politics we understand, in the most general sense of the term, whatever pertains to the decision concerning the fate of a community, it patently depends on the imaginal because it depends on the possibility of making the public exist in the first place. This holds not only for large communities such as modern states or the entire globe, but also for small ones. Even in small communities, you need to imagine a community in order to make it exist out of a simple collection of individuals. Politics depend on imaginal because it depends on the possibility of imagining commonalities and therefore on the possibility of freeing oneself of one's own particularities. But, and here we come to the change, the images that mediate contemporary politics have undergone a deep change that is both quantitative and qualitative. Let's begin with the quantitative change and just think for a moment of what politics used to be a mere 300 years ago and what it is now. Whereas most people in the past had very few occasional visual contact with their leaders, today political leaders are constantly in front of us on our public arenas, but also in our houses and now even in our pockets. We are so image saturated that it becomes increasingly difficult to create new ones and to truly believe in them. We could summarize this state of affairs by saying that we have now too many images and too little imagination. For instance, just to make an example, we have so many images of climate change disasters in front of our eyes that we have lost the capacity to imagine what that truly implies. This crisis of imagination has, however, paradoxically been accompanied by an excess of it. We could say that the creative side of imagination is in crisis precisely because of the hypertrophy of the passive side of it. In terms of quantity of images, indeed, we cannot but notice an extraordinary increase in the sheer number of images that enter our life. In the quantity of images produced by social media in particular has reached such a proportion as to produce a qualitative life. As philosophers like to remind us, there is a threshold after which even just a mere quantitative increase turns into a new quality. And today we are indeed faced with a new quality that people have tried to grasp under different names: populism, post-truth democracies, or post-fact politics. The name changes and each category would require a whole talk in itself, but they all point to the same transformation, what I would call the imaginal turn in politics. There is a turn where politics is so consubstantial to the image that the status of reality of images is being questioned. Politics has always been imaginal to a minimal degree, but the extent to which it relies on images today, images of its leader, images of the people, images of its spectacles, images of its rituals, images of its everyday crisis, is unprecedented. Political globalization, we could say, is first and foremost a globalization in the image. Yet images unify us globally, but it can also divide us. Given the huge number of images competing on our screen, a selection must be operated. And only those images that can capture people's attention stand a chance to win the competition. Hence the prevalence of the register of the spectacle and of strong emotion. When scrolling down a social media, the criteria for the selection among the innumerable stream of images is very simple. The algorithm will provide the content you're most likely to like, and therefore a content that is likely to reinforce your own specific view of the world, even while apparently projecting you in the social world. Along with the quantitative change and the consequent spectacularization of images, there has also been a qualitative change, which can be summarized with the term virtualization. The latter directly impacts the phenomenology of images, that is the way in which we perceive and relate to images. Behind the virtual revolution, there is indeed a deep change in the nature of images that is not only likely to change the way we perceive them, but also the nature of politics. Not only images are now commodities, which are therefore subject to the laws and treatment of all other commodities, including the competition between them, but they're also now malleable in a way that it has never been the case before. In the epoch of Photoshop or Snapseeds, images are both serially reproducible and intrinsically modifiable up to such a degree that they lose their link with the here and now. Whereas with cellular photography, images still had a connection with their original creation, as Walter Benjamin emphasized. We can say that now the virtuality, the idea of an original moment of a here and now in the production of images has lost its meaning. We have a hard time determining the here and now of the original creation of a virtual image and therefore its authenticity. In sum, we could say virtual images are no longer objects that have been created in a precise here and now, but rather processes that are constantly ongoing and constantly changing. Now, this mere technological change deeply affects the way we perceive images and therefore also our ontological and epistemological assumption as we approach images. We know that social media images can be created by assembling words and images that were not meant to go together, by collating and manipulating images deeply in their nature. But this skepticism of the image pushes us to abandon traditional claims to truth as correspondence in exchange of the psychological reassurance of being on the good side of the political battle. This is why today images no longer simply mediate our doing politics, but risk doing politics in our place, as I think we have seen in many of the neo-authoritarian turn. Sure, there could be a potentially democratic element in this process because everybody endowed with a smartphone can now intervene in a virtual image. But it also opens up a new terrifying scenario precisely because the phenomenology of images have changed and the neo-authoritarian leader can profit of this change. The point is that we have no secure criteria to determine the authenticity of images inundating us every day, while also being scattered in a condition of permanent crisis, which are said to require immediate political action. In this hyper-accelerated stream of images and constant crisis, anything goes, so long as it can capture people's attention, make sure they will not scroll down, but rather stick with the image, repost and retweet it. It's only by taking into account this transformation of the phenomenology of images that, in my view, is possible to come to terms with phenomena such as the new authoritarian populism and even with the resurgence of neo-fascism. The latter does not simply result from a manipulation of our capacity of imagining, as we have seen in traditional fascist propaganda. It feeds on the more recent qualitative and quantitative transformation of the imaginal that made it possible in the first place. In other words, we need to understand why people were ready to exchange fake news for real news when it comes to their political choices. And there is no way of making sense of this paradox without taking into account the imaginal turn in politics, along with the power of the social media that have made it possible. In the remaining of my talk, I would like to focus on the imaginal politics of one of the most imaginal leaders of our time, Donald Trump. Although this is a specific case of neo-authoritarianism, I believe it is particularly illuminating of the way in which social media enable neo-populist and even fascist mass psychology. Just to be clear, we can expand this in the discussion. I don't think that the regime we lived in under Donald Trump was a fascist one, of some claim, but I do believe that the mass psychology that links Trump to his followers has clear resemblances with the fascist mass psychology of the past. It's not by chance, for instance, that one of the most, in my view, insightful texts for understanding the kind of mass psychology that Trump has triggered and benefited from is a small little text written by Theodor Adorno in the 50s, devoted to analyzing what Adorno calls the pattern of fascist propaganda. Now, this text has not been written to refer to classical fascism and Nazism, but has been written in order to address what Adorno, during his stay in America, perceived as typical of the American fascist and neo-fascist agitators. Now, Adorno says, the paradox of the neo-fascist leader is precisely that he can appear at the same time as a superman and as an average person. For most of Trump followers, indeed, the fact that Trump appears as just one of us, more rich and more audacious, facilitate the process of identification with his own image, which becomes in turn the symbol of a mythical America, the America that it was supposed to make it great again, an America that is white, settler colonial, and patriarchal. The leader becomes both ordinary and extraordinary, real and unreal, through this very imaginal performance of the mythology of the white America. The feeling of fakeness does not diminish his power. And this is, I think, is a point that Adorno had captured very, very nicely already when speaking about the American neo-fascist agitators of the 50s and 60s. He says, quote, the category of phoniness applies to the leaders as well as to the act of identification on the part of the masses and their supposed frenzy and hysteria. Just as people did not really believe in the depth of their hearts that the Jews were devil, they do not completely believe in their leader today. They do not really identify with him but enact this identification. They perform their own enthusiasm and thus participate in their leader performance. It is through this performance that they strike a balance between their continuously mobilized instinctual urges and the historical stage of enlightenment they've reached, and which cannot be revoked arbitrarily. It is probably the suspicion of this fictitiousness of their own mass psychology that makes fascist crowds so merciless and unapproachable. End quote. Now, I quote this text because Adorno emphasized this aspect of fictitiousness, which I think is really crucial for us. The distinction between identifying with the leader and enacting this identification is very important. The point he did is not so much the really felt hatred for the other, the Mexican, the immigrants, as much as the performance of this hate, which also explained the irony of these performances and the fact that Trump always played on this very thin line between sheer aggression and its simple allowance. As an example of this irony, consider a tweet that Trump wrote in March 2018, which reads, "Lowest rated Oscar in history. Problem is, we don't have stars anymore, except your president. Just kidding, of course." End quote. Now, we can read this as just the delirious mind of somebody who thinks that is not a president, but a star, and should have the next Oscar as a star. Or we can take this at the letter and see what it means. What it means is that, according to this tweet, history, which is written in capital letters, registers the absence of stars from the scene, except the president, written with a capital letter. And indeed, whereas all other US presidents before Trump used social media very parsimoniously, Donald Trump used them across the spectrum and constantly as a tool to express his own opinions and state of minds, uncontrolled, even against the advice of his own team, as if, and this is the crucial point, as if he were one of his followers, one of those 88 million followers that he had on Twitter, for instance, before it was banned from social media. With his incendiary and passionate communication reaching such an astronomical number of users, he could literally appear as one of them while signaling himself out of exceptional. If you are one of his followers, you literally participate in a performance with @RealDonaldTrump as both one of the many people you interacted with daily on social media and the only star available at this moment in history, as his tweet made it clear. This is somebody that Adorno had already understood as typical of the production of the ideology in the age of television. Ideology is not simply false consciousness, but through the cultural industry and television becomes a falsehood, something fictitious that we know it is fictitious, and yet nevertheless affirms itself ironically. Although this is certainly a feature of media images ever since the invention of television, we watch an image on television, we know it's fake, but we enjoy it because of its fakeness. I think that social media adds a further dimension to this logic. To begin with, television and movie theaters could count on people sitting in front of a screen for a fixed period of time. But when images are consumed on smartphones, while one is on the metro or at a bus station, images need to be even more spectacular and therefore even more quick in capturing people's attention. Hence, the truth of Donald Trump's statement Political leaders, and certainly neo-authoritarian political leaders like himself, must be as much, if not even more, of a screen stars than professional actors. While pushing the register of the spectacle and changing attitude toward the truth of the image, imaginal politics triggered by social media also has an extraordinary power of turning users into equal actors within the political performance. This change deeply subverted the logic of the division between the spectator and the audience. The followers of a digital leader are both spectators and actors of the political performance. It's not just that a personality like Trump, with his largely delusional narrative of the self-made man, fits the new social media. It is consubstantial to them because it is inseparable from the type of political performance that this new technology enables. By interacting on Twitter or Facebook with the leader, Trump supporters did not simply feel, but literally become protagonists of the performance of Trump underlying mythology, Make America Great Again, which is a mythology of the rebirth in greatness. Many political myths had this structure of death, collapse, rebirth in greatness. And Trump feeds on this sort of mythology. Think, for instance, of what happens to a fire lieutenant in Tuscaloosa, who on the evening of April 29, 2019, tweeted to a very few followers, "Granted, I'm in Alabama, but most of the firefighters I talk to are voting at real Donald Trump," end quote. And then woke up the following morning, and from being an unknown fire lieutenant, he became suddenly a Twitter celebrity with more than 50,000 likes in a few seconds, just because he had been retweeted by Donald Trump himself. Social media such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are thus crucial components of today's resurgence of authoritarianism worldwide, and their power can hardly be overestimated. While you're navigating on social media with the promise of friendship and community, you are literally navigating in a certain form of mass psychology that is populist in its very nature, because it constantly invites you to identify with a certain image of the leader as a representative of the people at large. So it's not just that authoritarian personality can skillfully manipulate followers, but that the media themselves have a manipulative logic because they deeply feed on and they exacerbate affect and strong emotions. Think, for instance, of how the algorithm decides on which post to show next on a news feed. The way in which it works is by selecting the image, as I already mentioned, that you're most likely to like, that is most likely to keep you glued to the media itself. Hence, the tendency not only to produce spectacular images, but also to produce emotionally polarized version of reality that progressively alienate those who see differently. By reading only the news that confirm your own opinion and your own view of the world, the algorithm tends to produce a view of reality that is self-fulfilling. You start believing that reality is in a certain way, and then you act in the world as if it were in a certain way. So in particular, this is what tends to produce a performance of the friend-enemy divide and a polarized view of reality, which is typical of neo-authoritarianism. The point is not deeply believing that the enemies are evil, that the immigrants, Mexican, are evil, but performing that hate, except that that hate then becomes the algorithm that builds the entire reality you live in. So many of Trump's 88 million followers ended up living in their own reality, one in which the Democrats had really stolen the last presidential election, in which democracy was really stolen. So it appeared natural to them, if to save it, they had to storm the Capitol as they did on 6 January 2021. But this literal storm of violence had been prepared by an imaginal storm of tweets and posts and messages that fed this alternative reality. And it's not by chance that, as a study recently published by the New York Times, it has been shown that Trump tweets constantly played with this register of attacks and violence well before the storm to Capitol happened. It is indeed shown that half of his tweets, all of his tweets produced until 2021, were indeed attacks to people. So to conclude, although I believe that this imaginal turn is crucial to understanding the surge of neo-authoritarianism, I think that technology and the psychology it sustains is not enough. They can at best describe how these phenomenological and psychological changes happen, but they do not explain why they were triggered in the first place. Along with Adorno, I think that we need an entire theory of society in order to explain why such authoritarian propaganda arises in the first place and what kind of interests it sustains. To begin with, the very fact that the global surge of neo-authoritarianism and white nationalism has been accompanied by financialization and the massive increase in economic inequalities that it implies cannot be a mere coincidence. Finance and financialization play a much weightier role than it ever did in the previous phases of capitalism, and it does so by creating a huge gap in global inequalities of care and access to the fulfillment of basic needs. So there is a crisis at the structural level with a more and more predatory financialized capitalism that is accompanied by a crisis at the hegemonic level, leading to widespread feeling of disorientation and disconnection. In these feelings of disorientation, speculative communities proliferate. The enormous success of contemporary social media is indeed inseparable from the emergence of financialization, that is, from the polarization of wealth produced by the abstraction of capital from materiality and the feeling of uncertainty created by lives that are structured by debt and insecurity. According to contemporary sociologist Aris Comporozos Athanasiou, financialization facilitates the widespread circulation of a speculative imagination, and social media are keynotes for that circulation, as an increasingly anxious society tries to rely on them to cope with the uncertainty of everyday life. There's something reassuring in connecting with your leader constantly through your social media. But this hides the huge axis of inequality behind them. And that's precisely where neo-authoritarianism proliferates as a result of uneven exposure to uncertainty, which yields huge profits for finance and the 1%, while it sows further anxiety for those without resources to play the game of speculation effectively. Thus, by ideologically depicting such uncertainty as the result of evildoers who dare to question our values and tradition, digital demagogues such as Donald Trump can protect their own interests, those of financialized capital, while pretending to protect those of all everyday people. The feeling of uncertainty is there and it's real in its effect, but its sources are fundamentally displaced to this spectacular performance of hate and scapegoating. The same globalization that brings us together thus also separate us in this spectacular opposition between us and them, between friends and enemy, an opposition that fuels hate, resentment, and violence. And that is where neo-authoritarian populism proliferates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chiara Bottici, for this very interesting speech. And now we take the time for a question. I received one from Ingrid Kofler. It's, do you think we can speak of kind of cultural industry of images where finally AI creates the political imaginary of individual bubbles?
Yes, I think it's the idea of cultural industry is still very useful. First of all, because cultural industry is still there, but I think there is a deep change that happens with social media. Cultural industry, at least the way in which Adorno and Horkheimer were talking about it, he really implied a relationship between the spectator and the audience that was implied a separation. In the movie theater, there's a clear separation between those who perform, the actors, and the spectators. Okay, what changes with the social media is literally the fact that this line is blurred. So there's no more division between the spectator and the actor. So in contrast to the fascist leaders that Adorno had in mind when talking about the way in which fascist leaders in American fascist leaders in the 50s use media such as radio, television, or the beginning of television, the way in which today neo-authoritarian demagogues use social media is completely different. So there's something that remains from the past, certainly the commercialization of images, the fact that within a cultural industry, you are exposed to the logic of commodities. So that remains, but I think there is a change with what concern in particular the relationship between the actor and the spectator of the political performance. And that is new. So we need new tools to address that.